This is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News at the People's Climate March in Washington, D.C., a very hot and steamy Washington, D.C. And I'm here today with Avi Lewis, a Canadian filmmaker, activist, and co-author of the Leap Manifesto. Thank you very much for joining us today, Avi.
Forgot fan of The Real News.
That's essential. Thanks for that clarification.
Founding fan of The Real News.
So, and you've obviously, you've had opportunity to work with Paul Jay on Counterspin many years ago.
You know, 2 decades ago, I told Paul it was time to get his ass on camera and just be the host, and I'm really pleased to see that he occasionally does that.
So is he. So I'd like to start by talking to you a little bit about the climate policies of our current Prime Minister. And as I know you saw, Bill McKibben, one of the leading environmental activists in the United States and the world, really, authored an op-ed in The Guardian in which he offered a quite scathing assessment of Justin Trudeau's climate policies. He called him a stunning hypocrite, a disaster for the planet. Where do you agree with Bill McKibben's assessment, and where do you disagree, if at all?
I think Bill could have been harsher because I've been looking really carefully at the numbers and at the impacts of Canada's various climate policies under Justin Trudeau, and comparing them, as Bill McKibben did in that piece, to the rhetoric and the place that Canada wants to occupy in the post-Harper era on the world stage. So I was in Paris for the COP21 in 2015, and the Liberals had just been elected, and they arrived with great fanfare. Canada's back. We get it on climate. In fact, what Bill pointed out in that piece, which is particularly hard, particularly for countries of the global south that are really experiencing the worst and first effects of the climate crisis, is that it was Canada who, at the United States' behest, at Obama's behest, who went into the negotiations and fought not just for the 2-degree target, but for 1.5. And 1.5 degrees of warming, limiting us to 1.5 degrees over industrial levels, is almost impossible now, because emissions just keep going up and up and up and up. But really, 2 degrees is a disaster for huge parts of the planet. And for marginalized communities in the rich world and in the northern hemisphere as well. So Canada led the charge on 1.5, lapped up the love, as my partner Naomi Klein likes to say, in Paris, and then came home and led a year-long process with all of the provincial governments to have a pan-Canadian climate framework. That framework, that deal, has been announced. The details have been released and agreed upon, and it was basically a political horse trade. That Alberta got 2 new tar sands pipelines, huge new expansions of existing pipelines. British Columbia got Christy Clark, the Premier of British Columbia, has staked her entire political future on 20 proposed liquefied natural gas export projects in northwestern BC, which there's some of the biggest fracking operations on Earth are in northwestern British Columbia. And all of that gas is supposed to go be liquefied in an incredibly carbon-intense process, loaded onto tankers, and sent mostly to China. So they approved a massive LNG project in British Columbia and these 2 huge tar sands expansions and pipelines. And in exchange for that, they got a carbon phase-out across Canada by 2020 or 2030, which is great.
Coal phase-out.
Coal phase-out. The carbon phase-out would actually be climate action on the level required. A coal phase-out nationally, low carbon fuel standards, which is significant, and a price on carbon, which it's arguable whether or not that's a really effective mechanism for reducing emissions. But it would be $50 a ton by 2030. And all of the provinces agreed to these measures and a number of other measures. So if you just look at the deal that Canada's government struck under Trudeau and break down the numbers on the new production that is involved, the massive expansion of our fossil fuel production, as well as the mitigation measures, which will lower emissions moderately, you could even argue significantly, still nowhere near on the level that's really required by science to fulfill Canada's commitments on the international stage, let alone actually set a leadership example that would put the world on a path to 2 degrees or even 1.5. None of that is even on the table, right?
When you say Canada's commitment, are you referring to the
Paris commitment, just the Paris
which was Stephen Harper's emission reduction target?
Correct. So even in Paris, Canada only had the crappy, lowball, insufficient, deeply disappointing Harper targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and they said it was a floor, not a ceiling. But of course now they're saying it'll be hard enough just to reach the Harper targets. So the Harper-Trudeau targets, which really are only a third of what Canada's fair share would be in terms of our capacity as a rich country, our technological capacity and our fiscal capacity, and our historical responsibility of building our wealth over the last 150 and more years on the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Our Paris commitments are only a third of what our fair share would be. And all of those measures in the Pan-Canadian climate deal, when you net out the numbers, and I've been working with researchers to really dig in and crunch all those numbers, they get us, honestly, charitably, maybe a third of the way to the Harper targets, which are themselves a third of the way to our fair share. So the big Pan-Canadian climate deal, if you give it a rosy view of what they're saying they can achieve in all these emissions reductions, is going to get us a tenth of the way to what Canada's fair share would be in actually leading the way on saving the planet's health and a safe future for most of humanity. So stunning hypocrisy when you're going around saying we're the climate government, we get it, we're gonna, we're the ones who are really gonna take it seriously. The dark Harper years are over. Stunning hypocrisy is a vast understatement.
Now let's talk about solutions, about a way forward. And I mentioned at the outset that you're a co-author of the Leap Manifesto. Many of us have read it. Intimately familiar with its details, but for those of our audience members who may not have had the opportunity to familiarize themselves with it, could you summarize the essential message of the Leap Manifesto?
Sure. The Leap Manifesto was released in the run-up to the last federal election by a large coalition, a broad coalition, really a once-in-a-generation constellation of social movements and social movement leaders. It was a document that came out of a meeting with 60 social movement leaders from around the country, First Nations leaders, labor, environmental groups from a span of like direct action, 350 type folks to much more staid, mainstream environmental groups, food justice, migrant and refugee justice groups, anti-poverty groups. So like really a tremendous spectrum of different social causes who came together around the vision of the Canada we want. And it's 15 political demands that would get Canada off fossil fuels in a hurry and do it in a way that systematically attacked disgusting historic levels of inequality in our country, the legacy and ongoing living structural racism in our country, and to try to heal some of the wounds that were opened up in the founding of our country around First Nations and the relationship between Canada and First Nations. So it calls for implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It calls for a rapid transition to our electricity system to be all renewables in a matter of 15 years. It has a lot of other demands, specifically around what some people call community benefits, that the communities and constituencies that are getting shafted in the fossil-fueled capitalism that we live in must be first in line to get the enormous numbers of good jobs, local revenues, and energy democracy that the transition promises.
Now, when I was, I had the opportunity to be at COP21 and to cover it for the Real News, and I had a chance to speak to Elizabeth May, the leader of Green Party of Canada, when I was there. And I asked her about the Leap Manifesto, and she was enthusiastically supportive of it, pointed out that she was the only leader of a party with representation in Parliament that had endorsed it. But then I asked her, well, my sense of the Leap Manifesto is that it really questions whether we can, in a profound way, whether we can solve this global climate emergency with a capitalist economy. And her response to that was that it's really not about capitalism, the problem is corporate rule. What's your view about this? Is this something that we can achieve? Can we resolve this crisis in a capitalist economy?
Well, so, I mean, what we face in terms of actually getting there are not huge technological barriers. In Canada, technology is available. We need hundreds of thousands of solar installations and wind turbines. The technology is all there. The market forces are more or less aligned. Capital internationally is fleeing the fossil fuel sector, and renewables are just surging. But to actually enact a transition on the scale required, on the scale that science requires, the scale that humanity and justice require, is going to require a marshaling of resources on a scale that we haven't seen since the Second World War. I'm not a big fan of like the military analogies, but if we talk about a wartime mobilization, you're going to systematically challenge the entire neoliberal project of the last 30 years, which has concentrated immense wealth in the hands of the few. So we've got two guys in Canada, Galen Weston and David Thompson, billionaires, who control as much wealth as a third of all Canadians. So more than 10 million people have the wealth of those two guys. Corporate taxes have been slashed in half in Canada, half under Harper and half under Martin and Chrétien in the Liberal government before. So in a generation, we've seen corporate taxes go from almost 30% to 15%. And what are corporations doing with that money? They're hoarding it. A couple of years ago, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives did a study on corporate hoarding. and they looked at like how much money is sloshing around on the balance sheets of major Canadian corporations. It was an amount just in excess profits, just in cash on hand, that was comparable to the entire national debt at that point. And meanwhile, we have people in incredibly precarious work. There's 1 million Canadians who are a percentage point interest rate rise away from going underwater on their mortgages and credit card bills. So for the vast majority of Canadians, life is more precarious than ever. Meanwhile, just seeing record-shattering profits quarter after quarter after quarter. We need all that money that's concentrated at the top. And billions, hundreds of billions of dollars have been sucked out of Canada by the richest and most powerful industry in the history of money, as that guy says. You see that guy there? It's just this lurker loitering around by our interview. I was worried he was going to disrupt it. But anyway, so we really have an incredibly unsafe level of stratification in our economy. And to embark on a project to save humanity and have a safe future for everyone, we need access to that money. It is completely off the table under the current arrangements. And the Liberal government under Trudeau has the lowest actual capacity to change the fiscal direction of our country that there has been in 60 years. Government spending, federal government spending, is at a 60-year low in Canada. There's nothing that Trudeau's doing to upset those arrangements. And so, you know, we really do have to challenge massive inequality and all of the rules that have been tilted in favor of just sucking money upward in the economy if we're going to have the resources necessary. There was a fantastic op-ed, a piece on Medium by Drew Ojajay, who will be familiar to some Real News viewers, just a couple of days ago, that made the argument that if the Quebec government is going to give $1 billion to Bombardier, and the federal government is going to give $370 million to Bombardier, and that's just the latest bailout, right? And then they're going to turn around and fire 10,000 workers, 15,000 workers globally, and while the executives give themselves tens of millions of dollars in extra bonuses. Yes. That's completely unacceptable. If governments are going to bail out corporations like Bombardier, they should use the bailout money to just simply buy them, to buy 51% of them, and to redirect them as publicly owned companies, cooperatively managed if possible, to actually make the light rail systems and the intercity fast transit systems electrified on the basis of clean, renewable energy that will take our country in exactly the direction that we need to go and create hundreds of thousands or even millions of jobs to save people who are falling through the cracks in increasing numbers.
So I'd like to talk to you, I'd like to conclude by talking, because I know Bill seems anxious and we're about to start this massive march.
What's going on with these people? They just lurk around at the periphery because they can't get their own interviews. That's the problem. People like Bill McKibben.
Well, Bill was...
We were talking about your op-ed.
Mr. McKibben.
Go ahead.
So I'd like to conclude by asking you about the people who are falling through the cracks and the people who are on the losing end of this grotesque inequality that we're seeing in our country, and that's labor. At the NDP's convention in Alberta, there was an attempt to broach a discussion. As I understand it, it wasn't an attempt to actually adopt the Leap Manifesto. The first step was to have a discussion.
Yeah,
and Unifor,
that was the resolution that passed.
Right.
That the NDP agreed that they would debate the manifesto in riding associations, and that there was even a weasel clause that I personally helped put in the resolution that said, and all of these specific measures in the Leap should be debated and adopted or ignored by different communities depending on their regional circumstances, which was like an Alberta out clause. Right. Doesn't get mentioned that much in the coverage.
Right. Well, despite the presence of that clause, Unifor, that I believe is the largest private sector union in the country, its leader, a gentleman by the name of Diaz.
Jerry Diaz.
Yeah. He was quite upset about the fact that there was, it seemed to, those of us on the outside looking in, about the fact that there was a discussion taking place about the Leap Manifesto. And so the question that I have for you is, how do you get organized labor on board, and how do you get them to stop feeling threatened? Because, and let's be frank and fair to organized labor. Mm-hmm. They've suffered immensely over the last several decades, and they're perfectly entitled and justified in feeling suspicious about, the direction that this is all going to take. But at the end of the day, we need them to be on board, and how are we going to get them
Absolutely. There? So, okay, first of all, in terms of Jerry Diaz and Unifor, the largest public sector union, a private sector union in Canada, he was standing beside the NDP former member of Parliament, Megan Leslie, on the floor of that NDP Edmonton convention while she spoke on behalf of the Leap Manifesto. So he was with us, and he was against us, and he was with us, reflecting the ambivalence in the leadership of organized labor in Canada, some unions. Much harsher was Gil McGowan, the head of the Alberta Federation of Labor, who called us latte-swilling, downtown Toronto, ivory tower elitists who were dragging our trash across his front lawn. This reflects a kind of atavistic, old school smear and cliche about environmentalists versus trade unions and working people, which is just really belongs in a glass case in a museum. It's not the fact today. At this extraordinary march today, which specifically is named, climate, jobs, and justice. Trade unions are here, not all of them, but many of the biggest, and the trade union members are here in profusion, as they were in marches like in Toronto in 2015, the Job Justice Climate March in Toronto. And, we had Hassan Youssef, the head of the Canadian Labour Congress, the biggest labour federation in Canada, who was one of the first signers of the Leap Manifesto. Paul Moyse, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, former president, leader of the largest public union in Canada, who signed it as well. There are huge parts of the labor movement that are completely behind rapid transition and huge public investments in the transition away from fossil fuels, because they understand that the fossil fuel industry is a sunset industry. Everybody understands that. The fossil fuel industry itself understands that and is planning for the future when they're not fighting it with the other hand. The oil majors are bailing from the tar sands investments in huge numbers, and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment are now off the table. So everybody understands that we're going to be off fossil fuels at some point. The question is whether labor leaders really have their workers' interests in mind when they fight against environmentalists and against energy transition in favor of a relatively small number of existing jobs, or whether they start putting those people back to work now in a massive energy transition that would create untold economic opportunities. 100,000 or more people who have been fired in Alberta since the oil price crash of 2014. Those skills of boilermakers and pipe fitters and industrial electricians and journeymen and trades of all kinds map almost perfectly to the skills that we need for geothermal electricity, for solar and wind installation. There are vast opportunities for those very same people who have been abandoned by the oil and gas industry, not satisfied with sucking hundreds of billions of dollars of profits out of the Alberta tar sands, then abandons an entire generation of workers when the price crashes. Labor leaders in Canada, have beautiful climate policies on their books, but they don't actually put their bargaining muscle behind them too much of the time. And that is, we believe, that is not serving their members. That's not the kind of leadership that their members need. There are huge job opportunities in a transition done with public ownership, with massive public investments, and it's part of the struggle that goes back to the roots of the labor movement to protect workers. The real slogan of the Leap Manifesto when it comes to workers is no worker left behind, because no worker should ever be forced to pay for a transition that they didn't ask for, that they didn't contribute to.
You're here. Thank you very much for speaking to us today, and I wish you a wonderful People's Climate March.
A pleasure. Thank you.